And I have the happy duty of introducing our last speaker before lunch, who's a dear colleague and friend, Tom Davenport. The only problem with Tom is he's a little bit annoying because the time that elapses between when Eric and I become aware of something interesting happening at the world of technology and business and the time that Tom has published a book on it is actually shrinking instead of growing. So Tom was one of these phenomenally productive guys who has a combination of a great eye and a great ear for the next interesting topic about how technology is changing the business world. And then some combination of a fantastic work ethic and great productivity to get the ideas, get the book out there when the rest of us are still just having our first conversations about it. The latest example of this is Tom's new book with Julia Kirby called Only Humans Need Apply: Winners and Losers in the Age of Smart Machines. Tom?
Thanks, Andy, but I do have to confess that I was very much alerted to this topic by you guys. I read The Second Machine Age and saw them flying all around the world to talk about it, and I thought, clearly this is an important topic, and because their primary focus was kind of to establish the problem in that book, I thought, well, great, I'll write about what people and organizations can start to do about it. So I have them to thank. It's part of the benefit of being a digital fellow here at the IDE. I was promoted from analog fellow a couple of years ago. It's one thing that I have found in my association with MIT, you're not going to compete effectively on data with some of these postdocs and professors and so on. So let me start with a story for you about my topic. This is a story of a man named Alexander Hafez, Esquire, H-A-F-E-Z, if you want to look him up on LinkedIn. Real person, lawyer, lives in DC. By his own admission, went to, first he called it a third-tier law school, but then he revised that when he saw the draft of an article about him, to second-tier law school. Fortunately, was able to get a job on the partner track in a law firm. But in the financial crisis, Billings suffered and he was cut loose by this firm. And what lawyers generally do when they are cut loose from a partner track in a big law firm is they go into this role of contract document review, which is not a pretty sight for many of these people. Alex said I could do it and make fairly good money at it, even though we used to do contract document review with partner track lawyers for $300 or $400 an hour. When it got contracted out, that fee dropped to $25 an hour. I'm not sure if that was reflected in GDP statistics or not. But, Alex said I could do it and make decent money, but it was so mind-numbing. He said I had to listen to books on tape while I was scanning these documents to see if they were relevant to a commercial litigation case. But then he said, I started reading about this thing called e-discovery and predictive coding that would automate even contract document review, the last refuge of people who fell off the partner track. And he said, so I decided I would take some initiative, that very important skill we heard about earlier. And he said, instead of listening to a novel while I was working, I listened to e-discovery for Dummies. There is such a book. He said, I thought, he lives in DC, I would go to a week-long course that Georgetown offered. Neither he nor the vast majority of law school students in the United States even hear the term e-discovery while in law school, which I think should be reason for malpractice. But he started studying up. He went to several vendor programs. He is now a very well-paid, I won't reveal his salary, but a very well-paid solution architect for a leading e-discovery and predictive coding software vendor and consulting firm. So this is an example of somebody who was threatened by oncoming automation and said, I'm going to do something about it. Now, I don't know how many people there are in this world like Alex Hafez. Are there 1 million? I suspect there are. Are there 100 million people in the United States alone who would kind of take the initiative to learn a new career and so on? That might be pushing it a bit, but my general argument is we need a lot more Alex Hafezes if we're going to be successful in the age of smart machines. So why do organizations automate work? There are a whole variety of reasons. Contract document review, as an example, is mind-numbing, according to Alex anyway. Even at $25 an hour, it adds up. My guess is the decision making is not that high quality if you're listening to a novel while you're scanning. And we in general now know that human beings, I'm sure Eric never propagated this myth, but humans are not particularly rational after all. We have found that out. They make pretty bad decisions much of the time. We have a whole school of economics now called behavioral economics, mostly founded by psychologists, I might add, that really address this issue. So, one could argue we should be relieved from our decision making. In many cases, there's just too much data. Those digital ads that Adam showed, an organization has about 15 milliseconds to place a digital ad on the New York Times website that is customized to your supposed preferences based on about 50 megs of cookie data on your PC and based on about 5,000 new models a week for personalization. Any of you handle that on your own without computerized help? I suspect that would be a little tough for humans to do. So all sorts of good reasons for this sort of automation. By the way, this is not a new thing. At MIT, among other places, more than 50 years ago, people were talking about statistical models that are the basis of what we now call deep learning. And you can kind of trace a smooth path all the way from correlation and regression, the most common statistical analysis approaches, to some of the really cool stuff that's happening at Google and Facebook and so on today. So I think we should not think of this as a new thing, but rather, as somebody said yesterday at the MIT CIO Symposium, the next logical step beyond traditional analytics. The big question then comes, Eric and Andy also focused more, I think, in their great book on jobs that we know are going to be automated because, as we know, they got to ride in a Google autonomous vehicle, and first they were excited and then they were bored and so on. But I was very interested. I wrote a book a few years ago on knowledge worker productivity. Hardly anybody bought that particular book, but I was particularly interested in what does this mean for knowledge workers? The jobs that our parents told us to aspire to, professor and doctor and lawyer and marketer and journalist and so on. It's a pretty logical trend to draw from industrial work being taken over by machines to service work in the 20th century and still ongoing to knowledge work today. So is that going to happen? Well, my answer is a firm yes and no. Yes, in the sense that many knowledge work tasks are already automated in some fashion or other, like e-discovery and predictive coding. We will probably see some knowledge workers lose their jobs, but contrary to what you may have read in an Oxford University study, 47% of jobs are automatable. I suspect it will be on the margins. This happens slowly, for one thing. There are now virtually exactly the same number of bank tellers in the United States that there were in 1980. before ATMs and online banking really took off. So it's a slow process to eliminate complete jobs, and people are pretty creative about finding other things to do. We may end up with 8 lawyers instead of 10. Some people might not argue that that's a great catastrophe for our society. The good news is that there are going to be a lot of jobs like Alex Toffus's job. A lot of jobs working alongside with to develop smart machines. Nobody knows exactly how many, but those with initiative are going to gravitate toward those jobs. We will also have, it may not be reflected in official productivity statistics, but I suspect we will have dramatic improvements in productivity that could power retraining of a lot of people and guaranteed minimum incomes and so on. Whether we will do that or not, we're not a particularly generous society right now, is another question altogether. I think in general there's no room for complacency. If you're a knowledge worker or any other type of worker, you have to say what's coming to potentially take over my job and what can I do about it. Just in case you're not sure about this, do we have any professors in the room? You know about this thing called adaptive learning, and we saw the sources of online content. They could potentially teach a lot better than we could in many ways. Lawyers I talked about, I do a fair amount of work with Deloitte and other accounting firms. They're talking about 50% fewer entry-level accountants because of automation. We've had systems for years that could identify potentially cancerous lesions on radiological images. So far, I don't think a single radiologist has lost a job, but it's not quite the popular medical specialty that it was a decade ago. I was at the AP earlier this week, automated story writing for corporate earnings reports and second-tier sports teams, which I'm afraid probably includes MIT in many cases. Marketers, we heard about digital ads, that programmatic buying, and various other marketing activities done by machine. Robo-advisors, increasingly common. I'll say more about them in a second. Could be, I think you talked about them, is it you who talked about them yesterday, Eric? Somebody did from the stage. Architects, New York Times had an article a few years ago, want a job, go to college, but don't major in architecture, was the headline. Trading of stocks and bonds, stocks almost exclusively automated, bonds well over 50% now, and then finally, even the sort of the pinnacle of jobs, the pharmaceutical scientist, drug developer, Watson is being applied to that task as well. A little unclear how well it will work, but certainly companies are spending a lot of money on it. So no shortage of possible knowledge workers on the streets going forward. So Andy and Eric and Tyler Cowen and some other people have mentioned this idea of freestyle chess as a model that we might emulate. And I thought that was a great idea, although I don't play chess for a living, and I don't know that many people who do, so I thought it'd be good to look at some other jobs as well. But the model is that we're augmenting these smart machines rather than being automated by them. We're doing things that they can't do, or we're working alongside them to improve their performance. And I submit that that is not only the thing we should aspire to as humans. How many of you are human beings, by the way? There was supposed to be a screen at the door, but the robots are getting so lifelike these days. We should not only aspire to that as human beings, but that, I think, is the most likely outcome just because of the way the world tends to work. As I said about bank tellers, Jim Besson at Boston University has done some great work on the textile mills up in Lowell and Lawrence and so on. Apparently, if you knew how the power loom and the spinning jenny worked, one, you never lacked for a job, and two, we would probably, if we'd had more of those people, we would have probably had much faster increase in productivity from those innovations as a result. My and my co-author's contribution to this idea is really to identify 5 things that you can do to keep your job in the future. I have no data on this. I've always found it hard to get data about the future, but I have applied it to several different types of jobs, and it's worked pretty well. Stepping in is kind of what Alex Hafez initially did. He learned how e-discovery worked. He learned when to intervene. He basically made an e-discovery computer program his colleague. He got into the belly of the automated beast, if you will. And I think these will be the most common types of augmentation-oriented jobs involving working with machines. Stepping up is when, take a hedge fund manager. Sure, all trading is being done by a machine, but somebody looks over the portfolio and says, how well is this going? Do we need more automation, less automation, different automation? I'm told that's worked out pretty well for hedge fund managers as a source of a living. There's also, there are 2 categories of jobs that involve not doing what machines do. Stepping aside is one of them. It means doing something that computers are just not very good at least yet, and hopefully for the near future. Might be, instead of going into commercial litigation, a friend of mine told me the other day he has a relative who practices law relative to malfunctions in automatic garage door openers. That's probably stepping aside. Or maybe it's the next category, stepping narrowly. It's certainly a niche. Very highly empathetic jobs, highly creative jobs, probably be okay for a while. Jibo to the contrary. Stepping narrowly is when you choose something that is so nichified that it probably wouldn't be economical to automate it. I first thought of this, I read a Boston Globe story about a guy who makes an incredibly good living. He drives a Rolls Royce around the streets of Boston, connecting buyers and sellers of Dunkin' Donuts franchises. And I thought, computers are really good at connecting buyers and sellers of things, as we all know, but that's probably a little bit too narrow for anybody to take on. So it's an example of being very narrow. In the book, we talk about equine law as a good example, the law of horses. But since then, I found there actually is a program for equine law office automation. And then finally, there's stepping forward, humans building the automated systems of the future. So, a few blocks from here, IBM has established the Watson Health headquarters. They're hiring 2,000 people to work on Watson Health. And I think we'll see, who knows how many, but a lot of jobs of that type. So I won't go into detail, but here's the 5 steps as applied to financial advisors to avoid robo-advice. And I'll give you one quick story about a student of mine at Babson who worked at Fidelity and he was as a financial advisor, and he said, I'm hearing the footsteps of the robo-advisors. Fidelity was working with a few different companies. Wealthfront, I think, was their primary partner. And he said, our advice is getting more scripted. And he said, you know what I'm thinking about becoming? A financial psychiatrist. Which makes a lot of sense, because anybody who knows anything about behavioral economics knows our financial decisions are not very good. There's a whole field now called behavioral finance. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk people down off the ledge when the market is crashing. He said, I'm going to reconcile the risk portfolio, the risk attitudes of husbands and wives, which any of you who've tried to do that know is not an easy thing to do. Men are overly risky, women are appropriately risky. Getting them to be on the same page in terms of financial investing is not an easy thing to do at all. So that's kind of an example, I think, of stepping aside. Of course, we write about Vanguard in the book as an example of using humans and machines to do a great job, I think, of putting robo-advice and human advice together. So for organizations, I think the the smart thing to do is to say, we're probably going to be augmented from the beginning, so let's really plan a strategy along those lines. Pick the right cognitive technology for your problem. There have been some examples of people choosing Watson, for example, since IBM has done an incredible job of marketing it and finding out it's not really the right technology for their particular problem. We'll have to get good at work design to figure out what the machines do and what the humans do best. Give your people some options and say some time to transition to which of these kind of 5-step directions they might like. And I think we're going to, somebody said in a blog post earlier this week, we're starting to need chief cognitive officers. I'm not sure about that, but I have encountered a few heads of automation. The AP has an automation editor, and I think we will be seeing a number of jobs along these lines. So with that, I will stop and shut up, and maybe if we have a minute or two before lunch, love to answer any questions. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you so much. Lucien Tarnowski from Brave New. I wonder, is there a 6th step possibly there that is stepping collectively or stepping collaboratively? Because I think if you think through the last, through the industrial age, the pendulum swung very much towards individuals competing jobs. And it feels to me that the pendulum's coming back towards this community need that we have. And when I think about jobs being automated, I think we often think about those individual employees being automated. But where we actually have an edge is as collectives, when we can really bring the intersections together, bring both creative individuals together with machines. So is there going to be more of a focus, do you think, on finding these smart collectives that just are much harder to automate?
I think that probably is a good idea. I haven't really thought about it all that much, but we have to be careful because I was reading recently about a Japanese robotics firm that bought a deep learning company, and the idea was that robots on a manufacturing line would start to communicate amongst each other and say, where the bottlenecks are and where they need to become more efficient. So maybe we don't have that collaborative ability to ourselves going forward. But otherwise, I think it's an interesting idea. Some people have suggested the most rational response is just to step out and retire. So that's another step possibility. Yeah. Sure.
I think at a societal level, this is a huge issue. And when you factor in the potential of machine learning and AI, and just to take one example, there's software here on campus that can get more than 90% of the way there in drafting a legal brief or a legal memorandum just from here are my facts, here's my jurisdiction, push a button. If you look at that list of 10 items and you say, what is it really telling us about the possibility for automating a broad range of skills once you add in machine learning and AI? I'm scared to death, not for myself, but for what's coming. And I'd like to know, when you think, since you're thinking about this all the time, 10 to 20 years out, what do you think the net impact of this kind of technology, including all of that, is going to be on employment?
Eric and Andy, I think, have done a good job at focusing on non-knowledge workers. I'm more worried there because they're probably a little, I think it's probably say everybody here's a knowledge worker, you're smart, you're enterprising, you're probably able to do what Alex Hofez did and say, I'm going to retrain myself. That may be a little less likely if you're a truck driver or something like that, and we all know that automation of at least long-distance trucking is coming pretty soon, 3 million of those in the United States. But for knowledge workers, I think I'm more optimistic than some, as I said, because of the slow pace of change in this regard. People like radiologists are able to kind of resist these trends. As I say, none of them have lost any jobs yet. I suspect, we'll see 10 or 20% unemployment. That's still huge in any particular economy, and I think because of that, we'll have to either move toward guaranteed incomes, which Switzerland is voting on in a couple of weeks, or you know, I think even better guaranteed jobs that would give us not only something to live on, but some meaning that typically comes from our occupations.
Tom,
Thank you.
Tom's book is available for pre-order, and for our stakeholders, we do have signed copies available at the registration desk. We are going to break for lunch now. You have several options. The buffet is set up in the room adjacent to this one. You may return to this room where the tables will be organized by topics, and we encourage you to have discussions with each other and with our researchers on those topics. Or you can choose a table on one of the patios or in the adjacent rooms on the far sides. We'll be back here at 1:45. Thank you.